There seems to be a lot of talk on the internet right now, especially on gun forums and on YouTube, about how the gay marriage ruling is going to have an effect on gun rights, an unintended effect on gun rights that people aren't going to like on the left. Well, I was reading about it, and it seems like most of this is coming from an article written by Alan West. And if you read the article, he's basically saying because of the way the court used the 14th Amendment to justify gay marriage, that's going to have a big effect on gun rights. After having actually read the article, there's only one thing I'm sure of, and that's that Alan West is not a lawyer, and doesn't appear to be much of a critical thinker either from what I'm reading, because he really makes some weak arguments in his point. He's basically arguing that since the court used the 14th Amendment to justify gay marriage, therefore they have to do it for the Second Amendment too. They have to do it for carry rights. Anyone that has a carry permit somewhere has to be recognized everywhere else also. Since they have to recognize marriages from every other state, they have to recognize gun carry permits from every other state and gun rights from every other state. Well, that's just not the case, and I'm going to tell you why. Now, before we go any further, let's actually talk about what the 14th Amendment actually says first, since our argument's kind of revolving around the 14th Amendment. Well, the 14th Amendment basically just says that Congress can't pass any laws that violates the rights of a citizen. They can't pass any laws that take things away from a citizen without just cause. They said the state can't remove your life, your liberty, your property without just cause, and that they have to treat every person equally under the law. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say, well, I don't remember marriage being a right in the Constitution. Well, it's not, but it's still a right of a U.S. citizen. Just because something isn't listed in the Constitution doesn't mean it's not a right. We have to remember the 9th Amendment also exists. And it says, basically, just because it isn't written here doesn't mean it's not a right. If it's something that most citizens enjoy and something that most citizens can do, and it's something that they have a right to do, it is a right, regardless of whether it's written in the Constitution. And it's a right for everyone. Now, driving is a good example of this. Now, I know a lot of people don't think driving is a right, but the courts disagree with you. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on, but keep that in mind for now. What West is trying to argue in his article, the point he's trying to argue, is that if gay marriage exists in some states, and the courts are saying, well, since it exists in some states, it's a right, so therefore all states have to offer it for cause of fair treatment, etc. If carry permits exist in some states, and your right to carry in some states exists, well, all states have to honor that as well. But that doesn't make sense. And there's one real good reason it doesn't make sense. Because this case wasn't about whether is it just a right because it exists in other states. It was about, does a state have a right to deny it based on a public safety issue? A big part of the argument for some states was that they had a public interest in marriage, enough so that they could regulate it because it served a public safety issue. They could say, well, marriage is just for procreation, so therefore we have a public interest in making sure that it's for procreation, which doesn't make sense because there's not a shortage of people, and if you have a marriage certificate, you're not required to have children. And they also were saying things like, well, we have a public safety issue here because if we allow gay marriage, more children will be born out of wedlock, which I didn't understand that one at all, but that was one of their arguments. Basically, what the courts just determined was there was no public safety issue for regulating marriage. There was no public safety issue, no outstanding risk to the public safety that gave the states the right to regulate marriage. And since the states had no public safety issue to regulate it, they had to allow it. If it exists, you have to allow it. If it's a right of a citizen, you have to allow it if there's not just cause to regulate it. And there's where the big difference between marriage and guns comes in. The courts have determined that there is a public safety issue with guns, and that the states do have a right to regulate gun ownership and carrying guns. That's the big distinction there. There is no public safety issue with marriage, but the courts have determined that there is a public safety issue with guns. Basically what they're saying is, think of it like this. If your neighbor sits on his porch and just starts randomly firing off into the wild, that's actually a danger to you and the society you live in. That's a danger to you and your neighborhood, so therefore they can regulate him being able to do that. If he decides to marry his boyfriend, there's no danger to you or your community, so therefore they have no right to regulate it. It's kind of like with driving, like I mentioned earlier. The courts have determined time and time again that your right to travel on the roadways in a motor vehicle is a right. But there is a public safety issue that gives the states the right to regulate you doing it. You have to get a license, you have to prove you can operate a vehicle, that you're not just going to go plowing through a schoolyard full of kids with your car because you don't know how to drive. So there is a public safety issue there the courts have determined. Now, I'm not saying I agree with the public safety issues of firearms, etc., but that's the legal distinction. That's just the way it stands legally right now. There is a distinction, and that's the distinction that Alan West seems to be completely ignoring. Once again, like I've said in videos before, this isn't going to come down to an argument of, well, they can do it, so I can do it. It's going to come down to reasonable restrictions and defining reasonable restrictions. Quit letting them get away with buzzwords like reasonable restrictions. Make them spell out what it is. That way, everyone, if we can read it, we can determine what's reasonable and what isn't, because a lot of us aren't going to believe that certain things are reasonable. Like I can see, okay, you can't be a convicted felon right now that's out on probation and carry a gun. I can agree with that. That's kind of reasonable. Some people might not even agree with that, but I would consider it reasonable. You can't wave your gun around in public firing willy-nilly. Yeah, that's reasonable that you can't do that. You prosecuted if you do that. You can't use your gun to intimidate someone. Yeah, I would agree with that. That would be reasonable to me. But we're going to have to sit down and determine what's reasonable, what's not. I think a lot of these things that people think are reasonable, if they had to say them out loud, most people wouldn't think they were reasonable. That's what we're going to have to do eventually. If it's reasonable in Texas, why isn't it reasonable in Maryland? If Texas just thinks, well, all you got to do is not be a bad guy and maybe take a class, which I don't even agree with classes, but if they think that's reasonable, why doesn't Maryland think that's reasonable too? You're going to have to come down to reasonable isn't defined by state or region. Reasonable is just reasonable everywhere. So let's determine what's reasonable. Now, is there a way to make gay marriage work for gun rights? Well, yeah, I think there is one way we can make it work for gun rights, and this is kind of far-fetched, but, the NRA or some other big gun organization like that should get a bunch of gift certificates, go to every gay marriage they can find, and give them a gift certificate for a free shotgun, or maybe even a free handgun. Free shotgun, it's like, hey, you just got married, we know you're probably going to buy a house, you're going to want to be able to defend it, here's a free shotgun from the NRA. Or, here's a free handgun, because in 20 years, when you're sick of each other, you're going to want a hobby, and shooting's a good hobby. Maybe we could recruit a whole new group of gun owners that way. But I'm not saying that gays aren't into guns right now, because Pink Pistols is a big group and that's all about guns for gays. So I'm not saying it's something new, but hey, it's free gun for people, so I'm all for it. Now, I know there are going to be some people out there that are going to want to work the system and go, I want to get gay married so I can get a free shotgun or a free handgun. If they want to go to the trouble of getting gay married to get one, I'm all for it. Free gun's free gun. And let's face it, most people aren't going to do that. They're either already married or they'd like to get married someday. But there are some people out there that are, let's face it, unfuckable. Those people might want to find another unfuckable guy and get gay married. Don't have to have sex. There's no requirement to have sex to get gay married. That'd be up to you after you, have a couple of drinks. But get gay married, get a free shotgun. If it's worth it to you, do it. I'd rather see two unfuckable guys or two unfuckable women doing that to get a free shotgun than I would actually having the unfuckable guy find the unfuckable woman, because then they get married and have a bunch of little mutant children, and I don't want to see that happen. We got enough little mutants running around as it is now. But I'm getting a little bit off topic here. So in the end, does gay marriage mean that gun rights are going to come to everybody? No. Is there a way we can make it work for us? Maybe. But it's probably just going to mean getting some really nicely dressed guys and some really butch women a free gun, and some unfuckable people a free gun too. You ain't even my real dad. I would much rather the unfuckable man marries another unfuckable man than finding an unfuckable woman and getting married, because then they're going to fuck and they're going to have a bunch of unfuckable children. We got enough unfuckable children out there now. We don't need unfuckable children. Unfuckable children. Can't say it that way. All children are unfuckable. Don't fuck children. What can I call them? Ugly children, mutant children. All right, try it again.